Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm glad we didn't have a conversation this year like last year about how we took a class on economics once and we're going to talk about what they taught us and then what's real world. But we did hear several members come down and talk about theory versus reality. I'm here to bring some of that reality too versus theory. You're right. In theory, if we pay everybody more, in theory, everybody has more money to buy more stuff. In theory, those evil business owners have tons of money in their pockets, and in theory, they can just take some of that money that's in their pockets and in theory, pay their employees more, and in theory, that won't hurt the bottom line, and in theory, everything will continue to go on like it does now, and there will be no consequences. But as a person who owns a business that doesn't have the luxury of living in theory and actually has to live in what's called reality, here's a little bit of reality. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if minimum wage was to raise to $12.50 an hour, that the sky is going to fall and the entire state will just basically disband and we will go on into some black hole somewhere. That's not the case. Some businesses will be able to absorb it. Some people will make more money. But here's a little bit of reality. Most small and medium-sized businesses, 30 to 50% of their cost is wages. 30 to 50% of their cost is are wages. And this is going to raise that minimum wage by 52%. So reality would tell you that if you ask a company who has 50% of their cost is wage, and now you're going to have to add a 50-some% increase to that wage, and to think there won't be some kind of consequence, members, that is just ridiculous to have that even thought. Let me give you one example from a business owner that I talked to, owns a small coffee shop, has 4 employees. And as we heard here, he actually pays all of his employees more than minimum wage. I think he said one was about $9 an hour. A couple of them are in the $10 an hour range. And then he has like an assistant manager that helps run it that he pays him $12. So he doesn't pay any of them minimum wage. But when this comes through to $12.50 an hour, that small business owner that owns that coffee shop now is going to see his wages go up by over 50%. And you're like, well, how can that be, Brian? If he's paying them over minimum wage, that won't affect them. Well, reality tells us we have something called the ripple effect. And those of you that were here last year got the privilege of hearing this speech, and you'll get it again. But here's how it actually works. As a person that actually does pay people minimum wage, they don't stay at that very long, a couple of months. But then when you give people raises, then you have people that have worked for you 6 months, a year, 2 years. They, all of a sudden, guess what? They work more than minimum wage. And when you raise the minimum wage like this does at $12.50 an hour, you're going to take those bottom people and now all of a sudden they're making more than what the people above them made. So now you've got a whole group of people, whether you're brand new or if you worked there for 2 years, that are all making $12.50 an hour. And then they come to you and say, hey, Brian, guess what? I've worked for you for 2 hours and now I'm making the same pay as the person you just hired. So how is that fair that I'm making $12.50 and the guy you just hired is making $12.50? Don't you think that since I've been doing such a great job for you and you value me as an employee, that I should make more than that person that just worked there? Well, yes, you do. So then guess what? We have to give that person a raise. And then what happens on that top of that? Well, that assistant manager, that person that is in charge of that person is like, hey, Brian, I'm in charge of these people, and now I'm making the same pay as them. And there's only a few of us in this building that are actually, they'll work for the same pay to be in charge of people and put up with all of that, myself and the other folks in leadership. But we chose to make the same pay to put up with all of that stuff. But in the real world, most of the people, when you put them in charge and you give them a bunch of extra responsibilities, are going to want to be compensated more. Well, guess what? The people below them are now making the same pay. So guess what? You need to give them a raise as well. And then suddenly now you have the general manager of the place coming to you saying, Brian, the managers that are running shifts have all got these big raises, and now I'm barely making more than what they're making. Don't you think that I should get a raise too? And then guess what? You have given them another raise. That is what's called the ripple effect. And so back to the small coffee shop owner, I was sitting down and talking to him, and I said, what would a substantial raise, just under $5? And he's like, Brian, that's not $5. If you do the math, that's not really $5. Well, ladies and gentlemen, evil business owners also have to pay something called payroll taxes, 8%. So this extra 4 something an hour times 8% is another 40 cents that business owner is going to have to pay. So it's not quite a straight $4.27 an hour raise. That business owner also has to pay an extra 8% on top of that as well. But I talked to that coffee shop owner, and he's like, Brian, I have people now that my coffee shop is starting to grow, and I've got a third person that I put on just in case business gets a little busy and people aren't waiting 10 minutes for a cup of coffee. So I've added that third person on just to provide that little better service. But he goes, you know what? There's no way if I'm paying that extra money, I can afford to put that third person on. So guess what? That third person that's currently working there, gosh, he no longer has those hours anymore. But then he said, beyond that, Brian, you know what? I'm going to have to raise every cup of coffee by at least $1.50 an hour, and that is to just barely bring home what I'm making now. And I'm here to tell you guys, this person, as the coffee shop owner, is barely making above what this minimum wage would be. If you're a small coffee shop owner and you've got 3 to 4 employees, you're probably making $30,000 to $40,000 a year. So he's not living super high on the hog. So it's not like he can just dig in his pocket. And that's if he can only, that's if he can sustain that higher price and then still be competitive in the market. I've heard several members in this chamber talk about large business and the big corporations, and we need to support the little guy. Guess what, members? The first coffee shop owner to go out of business is not going to be Starbucks. The first coffee shop owner to go out of business is going to be that small mom and pop place. Because guess what? Those large corporations, evil corporations, can absorb this cost more than the individual business guy. You want to see your local businesses go? Guess who are the last businesses to go? The big guys. The little folks are going to be the first ones to go. That is just the law of reality. And we heard about, well, what about the single mom, and she's having a hard time paying for her daycare. I wonder what the daycares pay their employees. I bet you it's not $12.50 an hour. So guess what? That cost of daycare is now going to be more expensive. So that single mom that is now making $12.50 an hour is now paying, wait, $1.50 more for each cup of coffee that she gets. She's now going to pay X amount of dollars more for her daycare to take her kids to daycare. We heard Representative Levenstock talk about, well, apartment rents are just crazy. Help my people pay their rent. What do you think is going to happen to rent if this passes? Because now suddenly $12.50 an hour, all the maintenance guys that work at the apartment buildings, all of the folks that go out there and do the landscaping, pick up the trash, shovel the snow, guess what? They're all making more money too. Do you think that apartment owner is going to absorb that cost? No, that's going to get passed on to all of the people that live in those apartments. So now suddenly that single mom that he's trying to help out is now paying more for her coffee. She's paying more for daycare, and then all of a sudden at the end of the month, her landlord comes to her and says, guess what? You get to pay more for rent as well. So now she's digging a little bit farther on that. She hasn't even gone shopping yet. What do you think happens when you pay $12.50 an hour to all of the people that stock the shelves at the local grocery store? They're not going to absorb it. So that price of milk that we heard is going up as it is now is going to get even higher. So basic necessities, just to buy milk, just to buy meat, just to buy maybe ramen noodles, whatever it is, that is all going to go up. She hasn't even put gas in her car yet. Guess what? When she goes there, those gas station attendants are going to be getting paid more. Well, that's if they're attendants anymore. We're seeing more and more of those places go to automation. Why is that? Because it's becoming cheaper to automate stuff than it is to pay a person. But if there is actually a person there, they're going to have to pay them more, so gas will go up. Well, she doesn't drive a car, she rides a bus. Well, think of how many people that are low-income workers. We heard it. We need to help those guys that work in the transit area and all those folks that do around that. Guess what? You're going to have to pay them more. So then they're going to have to raise the price of bus fare. So now suddenly she's going to pay more to go and get bus fare. And if she's a low-income worker, I'm assuming that she probably gets some services somewhere from a nonprofit. Well, nonprofits, guess what? It's a little bit tougher for them to raise prices because guess what? They probably don't charge. It's a nonprofit. In a lot of cases, a lot of what they do, they provide free services. But in a lot of cases, that doesn't mean that everybody that works at their nonprofit works for free. They also pay people. So now let's say their kid, the single mom, her kid goes to after-school programs at Boys and Girls Club. Well, guess what? They're having to pay all of their people more. Businesses are now paying more for their wages, so they're going to probably give less to the local nonprofit. And then all of a sudden, that local nonprofit is going to provide less services to those folks out in the community that need it. So it sounds great in theory that we pay these people extra money. But in the reality, it's not that businesses are just trying to be greedy and not pay their people more. There are real life consequences to when you raise wages, especially by an astronomical number of 52% increase. Members, that will have devastating effects. Will it kill our economy? No. But you can't tell me when you have a 52% increase on something that is a business's 30 to 50% of what they have, their cost is wage, there won't be effects. There will be people that will see their hours decrease. There will be people that will be laid off. And so if people are out there voting on that, this minimum wage person be like, hey, that's great, I'm going to get my $12.50, but my buddy next to me is going to be laid off. Hopefully that's not you that's the one getting laid off, and it's you that's getting that $12.50 an hour. Members, I urge a no vote. We already have something in our Constitution now that raises the minimum wage every year. There's no reason that we have to increase it more. Thank you.
Madam Majority Leader.